September 25, 1944. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stood in his headquarters at Koblenz. The room was cold. The news was colder. Before him lay the casualty reports from Lorraine. 285 panzers, destroyed, gone, in 5 days. The most powerful armored counteroffensive Germany had launched on the Western Front since Normandy had been shattered, not by overwhelming numbers, not by endless waves of American reinforcements, but by a single combat command, roughly 50 Shermans, against Germany's newest, most advanced panzer brigades. Rundstedt picked up the telephone. He had to call Berlin. He had to explain to Adolf Hitler how the Führer's hand-picked panzer brigades, equipped with brand-new Panther tanks, had been annihilated by George Patton's tankers in the mud and fog of a French village most Germans had never heard of. Arracourt. The name meant nothing then. Today, military historians study it as one of the most lopsided armored victories in the history of warfare. Here is what Rundstedt told Hitler that day, and why it changed everything the German High Command believed about fighting the Americans. To understand what happened at Arracourt, you need to understand September 1944. The Allies were winning, but not the way they'd planned. After the breakout from Normandy in August, Patton's Third Army had raced across France at a pace that stunned everyone, friend and foe alike. In 30 days, his forces had advanced over 400 miles. They had liberated tens of thousands of square miles of French territory. They had killed or captured over 100,000 German soldiers. But here is the problem no one talks about. By early September, Patton's army was starving, not for food, for fuel. The Allied supply system had collapsed under its own success. Every gallon of gasoline had to be trucked from Normandy's beaches, every shell, every spare part, and Patton's tanks were drinking fuel faster than the logistics chain could deliver it. On September 1st, the Third Army consumed 400,000 gallons of gasoline. They received only 32,000. Patton was furious. He was 60 miles from the German border, 60 miles from breaking into the fatherland itself. And his tanks sat motionless, empty. Meanwhile, Hitler saw opportunity. The Americans were overextended, their supply lines stretched thin, their armored spearheads isolated. The Führer ordered an immediate counteroffensive. Operation Luttich had failed at Mortain, but this would be different. Hitler had been secretly building new panzer brigades, fresh units, green crews, yes, but equipped with the finest tanks German industry could produce. Panther tanks. The Panzerkampfwagen V 75mm guns that could pierce any Sherman at 2,000 meters. Sloped armor that could deflect almost anything the Americans fired back. On paper, these were super units. 120 tanks per brigade, supported by panzergrenadiers in armored half-tracks, mobile artillery, anti-aircraft batteries. The plan was simple. Strike Patton's exposed flank near Nancy. Cut off the lead elements of the Third Army. Push them back to the Moselle River. Maybe farther. German intelligence assessed the situation with confidence. The Americans in Lorraine were scattered. Their famous air superiority was useless in the fog and rain of September. This was perfect weather for panzers. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, gave the order. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, would lead the attack. His objective was the town of Arracourt, a small farming village, unremarkable except for one thing. It sat at the junction of 3 major roads. Whoever held Arracourt controlled the approach to Nancy, and whoever controlled Nancy controlled Patton's entire advance into Germany. The Germans committed 3 panzer brigades, the 111th, the 113th, the 112th, over 300 tanks supported by infantry, artillery, everything Model could spare. Against them stood Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, roughly 50 Sherman tanks, some tank destroyers, a handful of armored infantry. The mathematics were clear, 6-to-1 odds, Panther tanks against Shermans. Fresh German units against exhausted Americans who had been fighting continuously for 3 months. Every German staff officer who reviewed the plan came to the same conclusion. The Americans would be crushed. They were wrong. You are probably wondering how 50 Shermans could defeat 300 Panthers. Let me tell you about Colonel Bruce Clark. Clark commanded Combat Command A. He was 43 years old, a career officer. He had trained his tankers relentlessly, not just how to shoot, but how to think. Clark understood something the German commanders did not. The Panther tank was a formidable weapon, but it had weaknesses. Its transmission was fragile. Its turret traverse was slow. Its fuel consumption was enormous. And most importantly, it needed open ground to use its superior range. The terrain around Arracourt was not open. Rolling hills, orchards, small woods, villages with stone walls and narrow streets. This was ambush country. Clark had arrived in the area on September 18th. His first order was not to attack, it was to scout. He sent his reconnaissance teams forward in the fog. They mapped every hill, every tree line, every possible approach route a panzer column might use. By nightfall, Clark knew the ground better than the Germans who would be attacking across it. That night he called his tank commanders together. What he told them went against everything the army had taught about fighting Panthers. Do not engage at long range. You will lose, close the distance. Get inside 500 yards. The Panther's turret cannot traverse fast enough to track a moving Sherman at close range. Aim for the flanks, aim for the rear, and never ever attack head-on. There was something else. Clark had noticed the weather, heavy fog, low clouds. These conditions grounded American aircraft, but they also blinded German reconnaissance. The Panzer brigades would be attacking without knowing exactly where the American tanks were positioned. Clark used this. He dispersed his Shermans across the landscape, not in the obvious defensive positions the Germans would expect, but in the dead ground, the hollows, the reverse slopes where a tank could hide until an enemy passed, then emerged to strike from behind. It was not a conventional defense. It was a trap. On the morning of September 19th, Clark received intelligence that German armor was massing east of Arracourt. The attack would come at dawn. He gathered his officers one final time. His instructions were simple: let them come. Let them think they have broken through, then cut them to pieces. September 19th, 1944, 05:30 hours. The fog lay thick across the Lorraine countryside. Visibility was less than 100 yards. The 113th Panzer Brigade began its advance toward Arracourt. Column formation, Panthers in front, Panzer Grenadiers following in half-tracks. They moved slowly through the murk, navigating by compass. The brigade commander was confident. His orders were clear: push through to the American supply lines, destroy everything in your path. What he did not know was that Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams was waiting for him. Abrams commanded one of Clark's tank battalions. He would later become the Army's chief of staff. The tank that replaced the Sherman would bear his name. But on this September morning, he was simply another tanker, sitting in his Sherman, engine idling, watching the fog. 0700 hours. The first Panther emerged from the mist. Abrams did not fire, he waited. Let the column extend. Let more tanks pass his position. Then he gave the order. The first Sherman round struck a Panther in the engine compartment. The tank erupted in flames. Before the German crew could react, 4 more Panthers were hit. Their ammunition cooked off in spectacular explosions. The German column was caught in a nightmare. They could not see where the fire was coming from. Their radios crackled with confused reports. Panthers turned to engage, but their targets had already moved. The Americans were everywhere and nowhere. By 0800 hours, the 113th Panzer Brigade had lost 27 tanks. They had not destroyed a single Sherman. The German commander ordered a retreat. His unit had been in combat for less than 90 minutes, but the battle was only beginning. September 20th. The Germans regrouped. Reinforcements arrived. The 111th Panzer Brigade joined the assault. This time they would advance on a broader front, spread out, harder to ambush. It did not matter. Clark had repositioned his forces overnight. He knew the Germans would adapt. So he adapted first. The fog was thinner that morning. Visibility improved to 300 yards, still not enough for the Panthers to use their superior range, but enough for the Americans to see them coming. At 06:15 hours, the German assault began. 40 Panthers pushed toward the village of Arracourt. They expected resistance at the village edge. Instead, they found it in the wheat fields before they arrived. Captain William Grunwald commanded a platoon of 5 Shermans. He had hidden his tanks in a sunken road, invisible until you were directly beside them. When the German column passed, he emerged behind them. In 12 minutes, Grunwald's platoon destroyed 8 Panthers. They took no losses. Then they disappeared back into the landscape before the Germans could respond. This pattern repeated across the battlefield. The Americans refused to fight the battle the Germans wanted. No set-piece engagements. No linear defense. Just relentless, unpredictable strikes from every direction. Let me give you a number. By the end of September 20th, the Germans had committed over 150 tanks to the Arracourt sector. They had lost 43 of them. The Americans had lost 3 Shermans. 3. September 21st brought rain, heavy rain. The fog returned, and with it came the final German push. Von Manteuffel was under enormous pressure. Hitler was demanding results. The counteroffensive was supposed to have shattered the American line by now. Instead, his panzer brigades were being bled white. He committed his reserve. Fresh tanks from the 112th Panzer Brigade, crews who had not yet experienced what awaited them. 0500 hours, the attack began. This day would be the bloodiest of the battle. The Germans pushed hard. They achieved local breakthroughs. For a few hours, it seemed the American line might buckle. German tanks reached the outskirts of Arracourt itself. Then Colonel Clark played his final card. He had held back a company of tank destroyers. M18 Hellcats, fast, lightly armored, but carrying 76mm guns that could penetrate a Panther's side armor at 800 yards. Clark sent them in on the German flanks. The effect was devastating. The Panthers, focused on the Shermans to their front, never saw the Hellcats coming. Tank after tank burst into flames. Crews bilayed out into the mud. Some were captured, most died. By noon, the German attack had collapsed. The 112th Panzer Brigade reported 60% losses. Combat ineffective, done, but the Americans were not finished. September 22nd, the fog began to lift. For the first time in 4 days, the sky cleared enough for aircraft. Patton had been waiting for this moment. He had screamed at headquarters, demanded air support. Now it came. P-47 Thunderbolts of the 19th Tactical Air Command swept in low over the battlefield. They found the remnants of the German panzer brigades trying to withdraw. Columns of tanks, supply trucks, artillery pieces, all caught in the open. The pilots called it a turkey shoot. When the day ended, the German counteroffensive at Arracourt was finished. Not because they chose to stop, because they had nothing left to fight with. Let us talk numbers, because the numbers tell the story. Between September 19th and September 23rd, 1944, the Germans committed approximately 340 tanks to the Arracourt sector. They lost 285 of them, 84%. The Americans, 14 Shermans destroyed. 14, think about that. A kill ratio of more than 20-1, Panthers against Shermans. David had not just beaten Goliath. David had annihilated him. But there is something most people do not know about this battle. Something the official reports rarely mention. The German tank crews were not incompetent. Many were veterans of the Eastern Front. They had fought Soviet armor. They had survived Kursk. These were experienced tankers in superior machines. What defeated them was not American equipment. It was American doctrine, and one more thing, American junior leadership. The Panzer Brigade system Hitler had created was fatally flawed. The The brigades were new. Their subunits had never trained together. Their commanders did not know their subordinates. There was no institutional cohesion. The 4th Armored Division was the opposite. They had been fighting together since Normandy. Every tank commander knew his wingman. Every platoon leader understood his captain's intentions without needing orders. They were not just a unit. They were a machine. When Clark gave general instructions, his subordinates executed them with initiative and creativity. When the German brigade commanders gave specific orders, their subordinates followed them literally, even when conditions changed, even when the orders no longer made sense. In the fog of war, the Americans adapted. The Germans did not. Here is the human cost. Over 800 German soldiers were killed at Arracourt. Another 500 were captured. The 3 panzer brigades that had been intended to change the war in the West were finished. They would never fight again as complete units. The American casualties: 42 killed, 28 wounded. When Patton received Clark's after-action report, he did something unusual. He drove to Arracourt personally. He shook hands with the tank crews. He pinned medals on men still covered in mud and gun oil. According to witnesses, Patton said only a few words to Clark. "You have written the textbook on armored warfare. The Germans will be reading it for 50 years. He was right, but the Germans would not have 50 years to learn. What happened at Arracourt convinced the German high command of something far more dangerous than the loss of 300 tanks. It convinced them they could not win. September 25, 1944, Koblenz, Field Marshal von Rundstedt's headquarters. The commander of German forces in the West sat at his desk. Before him were the consolidated reports from Lorraine. He had read them twice. He would read them again. Rundstedt was 69 years old, a Prussian aristocrat, the senior officer in the Wehrmacht. He had conquered Poland. He had conquered France. He had commanded the largest armies in human history on the Eastern Front. He knew failure when he saw it. The reports were clinical: numbers, dates, unit designations, but behind the numbers were men, dead men, burned men, men captured and marching to American prisoner camps. The 111th Panzer Brigade, combat ineffective. The 113th Panzer Brigade, combat ineffective. The 112th Panzer Brigade, combat ineffective. 3 brigades, 360 tanks on paper, now reduced to fewer than 40 operational vehicles. Rundstedt picked up the telephone. He asked to be connected to the Führer's headquarters at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. What followed has been reconstructed from post-war interrogations, German staff diaries, and the memoirs of officers present at both ends of the call. Hitler came on the line. He demanded to know why the counteroffensive had failed, why his new panzer brigades had been destroyed, why Patton still held Arracourt. Rundstedt's reply was measured, professional, devastating. According to General Siegfried Westphal, Rundstedt's chief of staff, who was present during the call, the field marshal stated the following: "My Führer, the panzer brigades were committed against an enemy we did not understand. The American armored forces in Lorraine are not the disorganized units our intelligence described. They are professionals. Their tactics are superior to ours. Their junior officers show initiative that our men cannot match. We sent 300 tanks against 50. We lost 285. They lost 14. There is no tactical solution to this equation." There was silence on the line. Then Hitler spoke. He demanded to know what Rundstedt proposed. Rundstedt's answer sealed his fate. He told Hitler the truth. "We must shorten the line. We must conserve our armor for defensive operations. We cannot defeat the Americans in mobile warfare. They have learned too much. We have forgotten too much." Hitler exploded. According to Westphal's account, the Führer accused Rundstedt of defeatism, of cowardice, of failing to understand the revolutionary spirit of National Socialism. Rundstedt listened. When Hitler finished, he said simply, "My Führer, I have told you the military situation. The decision is yours." The call ended. But there is something else, something Rundstedt wrote in his private journal that night. It was found after the war and is preserved in the German Federal Archives. He wrote, "Today I told Hitler what every officer in the West already knows. The Americans have become the finest soldiers in the world. We built their enemies into masters. We taught them at Kasserine. They learned at Sicily. They graduated in Normandy. Now they are teaching us, and the lesson is terrible." Within 3 months, Rundstedt would be relieved of command, then reinstated, then relieved again. Hitler never forgave him for the truth he spoke on September 25th, but the truth remained. Arracourt was not an anomaly. It was a preview. You are probably wondering why this battle, fought in a small French village, matters 8 decades later. Let me explain. Arracourt changed how armies think about armored warfare. Before September 1944, military doctrine assumed that tank combat was primarily about firepower and armor protection. The side with the bigger guns and thicker steel would win. This is why the Germans built the Panther. This is why they were building the Tiger II. After Arracourt, that assumption died. The 4th Armored Division proved that tactics, training, and leadership mattered more than technology. A well-handled Sherman could defeat a Panther, not despite being inferior on paper, but because the crew inside knew how to fight. Modern armored doctrine still reflects this lesson. When the U.S. Army trains tank crews today, they study Arracourt, not Kursk, not El Alamein, Arracourt. The battle also revealed something about institutional culture that military reformers still grapple with. The German panzer brigades failed because of centralized command. Every decision had to flow through the chain of command. Junior officers waited for orders. When those orders did not come or came too late or were wrong, the crews died. The American approach was different. Clark gave his subordinates mission-type orders: defeat the enemy, hold this ground. He did not tell them how. He trusted them to figure it out. This philosophy has a name today: mission command. It is the foundation of how Western armies fight. And it was born in the mud of Lorraine in September 1944. But there is a human element to this story that we cannot ignore. War is not just about tactics and technology. It is about men. And the men who fought at Arracourt paid a price that no after-action report can capture. The German tankers who died were not monsters. They were soldiers. Many were conscripts. Some were teenagers. They climbed into their Panthers believing they were defending their homeland. They burned to death in those Panthers because their leaders sent them into a battle they could not win. The American tankers who survived carried memories they never escaped. Years later, veterans of Combat Command A would describe the sound of German crews screaming inside burning tanks, the smell of burning fuel and burning flesh, the sight of men on fire, running, falling. This is what victory looks like. It is not clean. It is not glorious. It is necessary sometimes, but it is never good. Colonel Clark never boasted about Arracourt. In interviews after the war, he spoke quietly about the battle. He praised his men. He acknowledged the courage of his enemies. He refused to call himself a hero. When asked what he had learned at Arracourt, Clark said, "I learned that the other side bleeds the same as we do. And I learned that good men die because of bad decisions made by people who never hear the guns." The Battle of Arracourt has been studied at West Point for 80 years. It has been analyzed by military academies in Britain, France, Israel, and Australia. The tactics Clark employed are now standard doctrine, but perhaps the most important lesson of Arracourt is the simplest one: never underestimate your enemy, and never overestimate your own weapons. The Germans had the better tanks. They lost. The Americans had the better soldiers. They won. That difference decided not just a battle, it decided a war. In 5 days of fighting around a village most Americans have never heard of, 50 Sherman tanks destroyed 285 German panzers. They shattered Hitler's last major armored counteroffensive in France. They forced Field Marshal von Rundstedt to tell the Führer what no one else would say. The war in the West was lost. Arracourt did not end World War II, but it proved beyond any doubt who would win it. Colonel Bruce Clark, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams. The tankers of the 4th Armored Division. These men deserve to be remembered. They fought outnumbered, they fought outgunned, and they won. If you want to hear about another time Patton achieved the impossible, check out our video on the relief of Bastogne, when the entire Allied command said he could not reach the 101st Airborne in time, and Patton did it anyway. Subscribe for more untold stories from the greatest conflict in human history. Hit the bell so you never miss a video. Thanks for watching.